Hey everyone, my name's Holly Darling and welcome back to another sew along for my newest Know Me pattern. This is ME2145. It does come in two size ranges. There's the 4 through 14 as well as the 16 through 26. So this is a stretch knit dress pattern. It features a squared neckline, a V-shaped waist with a gathered skirt, long sleeves, little tie details at the wrist, and there are inseam pockets. So let's take a closer look. Okay, so taking a look at the pattern envelope, here on the front we have the front and back of the dress. You can see that square neckline, that V waist, gathered skirt. It's a little hard to see in the picture, but we have the ties at the wrist. Okay, and then on the back we have our suggested fabrics. You do need to use a stretch knit fabric, only a stretch knit fabric. You can use jersey knits, spandex blends, rib knits, etc. There is a stretch gauge at the bottom edge here. Just make sure you follow the instructions there for testing the amount of stretch your fabric has. So the fabric that I used for this dress here, that is a cotton modal jersey knit. And you will see in this sew along that I am using a polyester spandex jersey. Very stretchy, very soft, works perfectly. But other than that, you just need some fusible knit interfacing. Make sure it's a knit interfacing. And then of course you have your body measurements and your finished garment measurements and your fabric requirements. Okay, so now let's take a look at the pattern pieces. So out of your main fabric, you have piece 1, which is the bodice front, and you need to cut 2 on the fold. Piece 2 is the back bodice, and you also need to cut 2 on the fold. So more out of your fabric, you have your sleeve band. Piece 9 is your pocket bags. You need to cut 4 of these. And of course you have your skirt front and your skirt back. And then out of your knit interfacing, you have 2 pieces. You need to cut 1 on the fold of piece 3 and 1 on the fold of piece 4. Okay, so getting started. Before we start sewing, the first step is applying that interfacing. So take 1 bodice front and 1 bodice back, and then you cut out your fusible knit interfacing from these 2 pieces. Just use your iron, follow the instructions for the interfacing, and apply it to the wrong side of the front and back bodice. And again, you're only doing it for 1 front and 1 back. So lay your back down with the right side facing up. Place the front bodice on top with right sides together. And we are going to line up the shoulder seams and the side seams. You can now sew all 4 of these seams 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. You can use a zigzag stitch for these ones or whatever stretch stitch you prefer. So this front and back is now sewn together, and you can do the same thing with the remaining front and back piece. Again, right sides together, match up the side seams and shoulder seams, and sew 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Here and here. Okay, once you have both bodices sewn together, you can press those seams open and then take one of them and turn it right side out. And then you're going to take the other one that is still inside out, and you're going to slide it over top of the other one. So these 2 bodices, the bodice and the bodice lining or facing, are now right side together. I am going to match up the neckline all the way around, making sure the shoulder seams line up. So here I have the 2 bodices right sides together, pinned around the neckline, match up the corners, match up the side seams, and now we are going to sew all the way around this neckline, front and back, pivoting at the small dots at the corner. Okay, so we are about to sew the neckline. It is best to use a straight stitch for the neckline. I know this is stretch knits and we use zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch for the rest of the seams, but for a clean finish on the neckline, it's best to use a straight stitch. So 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. And as I approach this corner, I'm going to keep my needle down and pivot. Neckline is stitched together. If you'd like a little bit more reinforcement, you can stitch over your first set of stitching right at the corners here, but that is optional. Now you're going to take your scissors and you're going to clip into the seam allowance right up to the corners. Make sure you do not clip through the stitching. Okay, so that's stitched. We clipped into the corner. Now what you're going to do is pull this open so that the facing / lining side is facing up and away like this. And you're going to understitch the neckline. So make sure the side without the interfacing is the facing side. So press that and the seam allowance up and away from the other side of the bodice. And you're going to stitch close to the seam along the neckline. You won't be able to go all the way around. You're going to get as close as you can to the corner and then continue around the back neckline as well. Here you can see how the understitching is close to that seam line on the lining side through the seam allowance. And at the corner, you won't quite get all the way around, but close. So then just turn that lining / facing to the inside and give that a good press. Neckline pressed nice and flat. Now we need to align the bottom edges of the 2 layers. This is not going to be treated as one bodice. So align the raw edges of the bottom, making sure the side seams are matching up. Pin in place so it stays all together. Make sure the notches are aligned on both layers. Okay, bottom edge here aligned, pinned together all the way around. You are going to base stitch, so the longest stitch setting all the way around the bottom hem, pivoting at the corner here. After you've done the basting stitch around the entire bottom edge, reinforce the corner with some regular length straight stitch, just about like an inch or so on either side of the corner. And then once that is done, just clip right at the tip there, right up to the stitching to the large dot. Next, we're going to move on to the sleeves. So the first step will be to reinforce each sleeve separately at the bottom edge between the dots here. So you want to go on either side of the dots and sew with a straight stitch about right here. And that'll be on each sleeve. And you can see I put pins since you can't really see my markings for the dots, but the pins are where the dots are, and that is my reinforcing stitching. So next we are just going to clip into the hem right at those large dots. Be careful not to clip past the stitching, just right up to it. On each sleeve, take that middle section between where you clipped and press it towards the wrong side along that stitching. And then you're going to go to your machine and stitch 1/4 inch from the folded edge. And here it is stitched down. Moving on to the upper edge of the sleeves. Again, I have put pins here at the notches on the patterns. Here and here. You are going to ease stitch the sleeve caps between the notches. That is, again, is a long stitch length, and do it 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge, and then again a second row 1/4 inch from the raw edge. I also forgot to mention, when you sew those 2 rows of stitching, leave some long thread tails. All right, and next you are going to fold each sleeve right sides together in half like this. Line up the raw edge here and stitch 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. You can use a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch here, and then you can finish the raw edge with your preferred method if you would like. Now grabbing the sleeve band. So you have 2 of these. Make sure you have marked the large dots on each of them. Take one of your sleeves and make sure it is right side facing out. Okay, so I have my sleeve right side facing out. You can see this here is where we have that opening. So I am going to take one of my sleeve bands here, and I am going to match up the small dots. So starting with one small dot, gonna line it up right at the edge here where the opening starts on the sleeve. Then I'm gonna bring it around and match up the other notch on the sleeve band with the other edge of the opening of the sleeve, and then just finished pinning that raw edge. Okay, so you are going to stitch that together between the dots, 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Press the band and the seam allowance out away from the rest of the sleeve. I'm just going to flip this way so it's right side out. So here it is right side out. The band is pressed up and away from this sleeve with the seam allowance as well. You're going to fold the band in half, right sides together. When you get close here to where it's sewn onto the sleeve, just make sure you match up those dots. Again, making sure the band stays right side together the entire time. That means kind of folding it a little funny here. Do that on either side of the sleeve. I'm going to do it over here as well. So then you are going to sew, starting at the short end, sew 5/8 of an inch along the short end, pivot, sew along the short end until you meet the small dot, or sorry, the large dot that meets up with the stitching that's already there at the opening. I'm going to do that on both ends. I'm going to do it over on this side as well. Once that is stitched together, you can clip the corners, trim back the seam allowance if needed, and then turn the ties right side out. Once you've turned them right side out, you can give those ties a good press. And then we need to finish this middle section here that's open. But what you're going to do is you're going to take this, fold it under 1/2 inch, and then press it so that it just covers the seam allowance, the seam line there, the seam allowance. Press that there, and then flip it over to this side and place pins from the outside. Place your pins here on the right side of the fabric. Then you're going to go to your machine, and from the right side here, you're going to stitch in the ditch right in this seam line, and that will catch the fabric underneath and enclose it. As you can see there, it catches that fabric on the inside. And that is it for the tie. Now we need to attach these sleeves to the bodice. Okay, I have my bodice. This is right side out. I'm actually going to turn it inside out so that the facing / lining layer is what is facing out. All right, I'm going to take one of my sleeves, and the sleeve will stay right side out. So bodice, wrong side out, sleeve, right side out. Make sure you have the correct sleeve for the correct side because there is notches for the front and the back. You're going to take the sleeve on the correct side, slide it up underneath. Right sides will be together. And you're going to pin the underarm of the sleeve to the underarm seam of the bodice. Remember, there are 2 layers of the bodice that you're pinning through. So you're with 3 layers total. So match up that seam. Also match up the other notches. There is a notch for the top of the sleeve that matches up with the shoulder seam. Now for the rest of the sleeve cap, this is what your ease stitching is for. You can find those loose tail threads. If you pull on them slightly, it will slightly ease more fabric to fit into the sleeve cap of the bodice. Okay, so that is fully pinned in there. The sleeve is pinned to the armhole. Now going to go and sew 5/8 of an inch around the entire armhole there. To finish the seam, you can also stitch an eighth of an inch away from the first set of stitching and then trim the seam allowance, or you can just use your serger like I did. And turned right side out, our sleeves are attached to our bodice. Moving on to the skirt. We're going to start with the front skirt. And as you can see, this pattern piece is quite large. You can't see it all on camera. I'm just going to bunch it together a little bit so we can see either side here. So there are notches on the side seam, or dots actually on the side seam, that indicate where the pockets go. So right side of the fabric facing up for your skirt, take a pocket, and there are also dots on this as well. Line them up with the dots on the skirt, match up the raw edges. Repeat for the other side, right sides together, match up the small dots. Okay, you are going to sew each pocket to the front skirt 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. Press the pockets and the seam allowance out away from the skirt. And then repeat the same thing with the back skirt and the other 2 pockets. Same exact steps. So with right sides together, you're going to lay your front and back skirt on top of each other. Okay, so right sides together, back and front, right sides together, you are going to line up the side seams and the pocket bag edges. Make sure you match up those dots here. So here is a full look at an entire side seam, just one side. And you can see I have lined up all the raw edges of the side seam and the pocket. You are now going to sew in one go 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge, from the top edge down to the first dot, around the pocket bag, up to the second dot, and then down to the hem. So there we are, stitched together. I'm actually going to flip this real quick to the back side. And take your scissors, and right above and below the pocket bag, you're going to clip into the seam allowance of the back side only. Right up to the stitching, but not through. That will allow you to press the seam allowance open, but the pocket bag towards the front. Okay, once the skirt is sewn together at the side seams, we need to gather the upper edge of the skirt. So to do that, set your machine stitch length all the way up to the highest stitch length. And you're going to do 3 different sets of gathering stitching. You're going to go from the side seam to the center front, break your stitching, and then center front to the other side seam. And then you're going to do another one along the entire back. And you're going to do 2 rows. You're going to do that 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge, and then again 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. And every time you break at the side seams and at the center front, make sure you leave your long thread tails, because that is how we are going to gather. Okay, so with your bodice right side out, I'm also going to flip this upside down. Right side out, bodice your skirt inside out. You're going to slide the bodice inside the skirt. That way the fabrics are right side together. You are going to be matching up the top of the skirt with the bottom of the bodice. So line up your side seams. And then match up the center front point of the bodice with that center front of the skirt. And then I also like to match up the center back of the bodice with the center back of the skirt. There are also notches that you can line up as well on both the front and the back. So once those key points are lined up, you start at one point, you take your long thread tails that you left, both rows, and you gently pull on them. And that gathers up the skirt so that you can finish lining up the raw edge with the bodice. So do that with each section. Gather up using those thread tails until the length matches up with that section of the bodice. You can adjust the gathers with your finger so that they're nice and even. And you're just going to do that with each section. Side seam to center front, other side seam to front, center front, and then center back. This is what it looks like once that section is gathered and matched up. Let me finish up the whole thing. There we have it. That is all pinned on now. Gathered and pinned on to the bodice. You are going to sew it together 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Normally I would sew from the skirt, the gathered side, but I would actually recommend sewing from the bodice side so that you can make sure you are stitching right up to where that V point is supposed to be. Since you have the basting stitching there already, it's a good guide. Okay, here we are. I am sewing from the bodice side and I am approaching that V center front. So I'm just going to make sure I have my needle down. And I'm going to pivot right at that center of the V. If you're doing it from the bodice up with the gathers underneath, make sure everything stays nice and flat under there. You're not catching the fabric. Okay, once you've sewn it together, you can press finish the raw edge if you would like. Again, not necessary, but I like to finish the raw edge. Press the skirt down with the seam allowance up towards the bodice. Okay, so the total hem allowance is 1 1/4 inch. So you can start by pressing up that 1/4 inch around the entire bottom edge of the dress. Once you've pressed up the 1/4 inch, then you can press up another inch for that 1 1/4 inch total. Okay, once you've pressed up that inch all around, pin in place, you can then sew close to the inner edge here, all around the hem of the skirt. And there we have it, stitched close to the edge from the inside. So you see from the outside, you can use either a zigzag stitch here or a straight stitch because the stretch doesn't really matter at the hem, although I use a straight stitch and there's still stretch, so. That is it. I hope you found this sew along helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments.